Hello and welcome to Midwest Writers Room. Our mission is to encourage, educate, and celebrate writers of the Midwest. I'm Luella Schmidt.
And I'm Ken Humphrey. Today's chapter break episode features Jackie Redmer and her latest publication, Dissociative Effect, coming out September 2026.
Jackie is a family medicine physician who practices geriatrics and palliative care in the Driftless region of southwest Wisconsin. She's also the mother of three school-age daughters. She started writing poetry during the pandemic to steady herself during the brief pauses of a busy life. Over the years, this has taken on different forms. Her writing has been published in the Examined Life Journal, the Intima Journal, Bramble, Pulse, Wisconsin Poets Calendar, and Kevin MD blog. She completed the Columbia University Narrative Medicine CPA program and pursued creative writing courses through Stanford University's Continuing Studies program.
I feel significantly undereducated, Luella.
Me
Let's
too.
uh, let's take a look at Dissociative Effect. This is Dr. Redmer's debut poetry collection. In this book, she reminds us that humans have evolved to think in stories, to talk in stories, to narrate an unfolding autobiography to ourselves in stories. She reminds us that the narrative process is a template for healing, as our narrative lives can be rewritten, retold, restoried. The, disso- the dissociative effect is a reference to the anesthetic ketamine and the distance one can sometimes feel from living an embodied, authentic life. It is also a testimonial to the perspective shifting that is a necessary part of healing and the wisdom that can come from aging. Dr. Redmer uses dissociative effect as her own blueprint for healing. She organizes the book in three sections: disease, diagnosis, and treatment, and exposes lessons learned when one looks deeply at the difficulties encountering in living a life. She writes, I opened you up to me, and there, in the radiance of darkness, were the seeds for a deserving life.
Welcome to Midwest Writers Room. Jackie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Ken and Luella.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on. So, with all these episodes, we always start with the author first. Before we even talk about your work, we want to talk about you. And normally, I shouldn't say normally, always, we like to know about your origins as a writer. You have a number of publishing credits listed in your bio. Are they all poetry publications, or have you written other forms of prose?
There's a number of those journals are narrative medicine journals, but I would say Dissociative Effect stands out to me, just when I look at what I've published, because it really was more of kind of I'd say it's more of the personal healing journey. I mean, just that what was included in there is coming from a lot of kind of different kind of places in my story, and just a lot of the poems were coming from different places and not necessarily some professional lens.
Okay, that makes
Mhm.
perfectly good sense. So it was a hinted a little bit in your bio, but do you want to kind of unpack what caused you to lean into poetry?
Yeah. So, it was right around the start of the COVID pandemic, and I would say that I found myself in kind of a difficult um, phase of life, more professionally and personally. And for some reason, I was reading and listening to poetry, and I was in my early 40s at that time, so maybe that was a midlife crisis, as it's called. Um, but poetry, I found, really was the language that spoke to the deeper parts of myself. And at the beginning, if someone had asked me to write a poem, I would have said, I don't do that, or I can't do that. I'm a left brain person. I practice science. I don't do that. Um, and but then one day, I just remember I came home from work, and for reasons I really can't explain, I had this idea that I should write a poem, or rather that I needed to write a poem. And and I think I just was so full of emotion, and then also was just had this feeling um that I was kind of living kind of as a shell of a person also. And then out of that particular moment in time came this poem, which was my first poem, that I called Decomposition, which was in the book Dissociative Effect. And decomposition, in the poem Decomposition, I describe just this internal experience of feeling like I was dying or decomposing, even as I was outwardly, living a normal life, or everyone was treating me that way. I have read that poem at times, and sometimes it stands out to me. I look back on that and I think, oh wow, like someone might say, well, you were depressed, that's depression. But I think I think that's really an overly simplistic viewpoint of what was happening, and poetry was a way for me to kind of unpack that and kind of take a bigger, just kind of to look at my own story in a different way. So thus followed from that really 2 years of compulsive poetry writing as I think about it. Most days I would come home from work and I just had to write at least one poem. Sometimes it would happen where I was in the middle of my workday and I would like go to the bathroom and write something on my phone. And then in the weird way that I think, Facebook sometimes knows things about you that you don't even know. Like they know that you need something, even though you don't know that you need something, in terms of marketing. They were suggesting this, that I take this online poetry class. And it was called The Poet's Way. And it kept showing up in my feed. And after seeing this for several weeks and watching this advertisement, I finally just said, okay, fine, I'll sign up for this class. So I signed up for this online class, and that was kind of the beginning of my journey to share poetry, which when I started writing poetry, I said, I would never share any of my writing, which I think a lot of people have that feeling that it's just too personal and it's not worth it, and actually I would ask people, I would go into these classrooms, or anytime I had exposure to a teacher, I would ask them, really, what's the point of sharing writing, poetry or really any personal writing if someone has a day job? Like, why would they do that? Why would you do that? And I got a lot of different answers, but, at the end, I came to appreciate that just as humans, that we really all have this longing to connect our internal selves with the external world, and with other people. And poetry, and storytelling is one way that we do that. And then I heard an interview with Mary Oliver in which she said that a poem is like a story, and it's not complete until it's heard by at least one other person. And I think that's really, having lived that, I would say that is really true, that, that the poem kind of comes to completion when you do then share it with one other person. I would also say that, that there is this saying that there's almost nowhere on earth that a person can go and stand more than 6 feet away from a spider. And I like to say that poems are as ubiquitous.
Can I just say, as somebody who dislikes spiders, I really never knew that. And now that's all I can think about.
I mean, I don't know, but it is one of those things that people say. I mean, the point is that, yeah, there's a lot of spiders out there, and they're closer than you think. And so I think, poetry is closer to all of us than we think. So all of the people who are like I was, who think they can't write a poem, it's like that it's actually closer. It's closer to you, than you think. And because poetry has this potential to address every aspect of the human heart, injuries of the heart, love, friendship, all of these things, anger, injustice, powerlessness. I mean, we know that the language is there and it really simplifies things, but also bringing the words together in lyrical form, it helps us to deal with those things. I mean, it helps us to reorganize the content in the brain, that is a real thing. And also our brains are, uniquely wired for lyrical language, and actually the language that type of language is oriented differently in the brain then prose in the language that I'm using with you right now. I really think it is the language that bridges the our internal and external worlds. When a person learns how to use words in that way to move feelings and emotions, that it takes away some of the powerlessness that we feel as humans. And that does have the ability to counteract depression and despair. And anybody who's written a poem, I think knows that and feels that. And that's kind of the healing alchemy or healing power of poetry. So I didn't know all of that before I started writing poetry. I didn't go into that saying, oh, I'm going to write poetry so I feel better, so I can, change my life. But it was more that I was doing it intuitively. And then I started to say, or started to notice that I was changing. I would take a feeling, an emotion, a story, and I would write a poem about, that sort of captured that. And then therein I would feel something different. And I think that engaging with lyrical language, it does that. It connects us to others, and has that potential to heal in that way. So it's kind of a long answer, but
I love that answer. I really appreciate it in particular when you said, you're basically trying to heal injuries of the heart. And so, it feels very natural for you as a physician to then be attracted, to being able to heal yourself. And so, talk to us a little bit about how your work in medicine shaped the way you approach this, approach writing about trauma in the body.
Well, and I will say, there is a long-standing body of research out there that acknowledges that the role of writing, expressive writing, and that the impact that has on numerous conditions, not just mental health, but actually physical conditions in the body. So that was kind of like in the back of my mind. I knew that, but I think that it's often looked at in the same way as, just like, well, if you improved your mental health, you would feel better. But actually, there is like some unique aspect of writing, specifically in expressive writing, that is different than just, like taking an antidepressant or talking to a therapist. Like, it has its own treatment. Just practicing medicine, really just puts you up close, to the intimacy of people's lives. And in some, form, I've been practicing medicine for close to 2 decades now, as a family physician. And now I practice palliative care and geriatrics. And the thing that I appreciate is just that these stories of health and trauma and disease, that for all of us, they are certainly very specific and intimate, that they are unique to each individual, but also they are often kind of shared narratives. And that's not to minimize the unique effects of trauma or the difficult experiences that people go through, but just to acknowledge, that when we feel like we're alone in our suffering, that often we're not. And one of the kind of pathways to healing, even when it feels like people are really trapped in what they're going through. And I see this a lot in palliative care, is kind of that the ability to find meaning in any set of circumstances. And so I would say that in particularly, influences or kind of helped in the writing process.
Yeah, I can appreciate that for sure. I feel like the sense that you are alone it can really overwhelm. And I find a lot of music and movies and novels and poetry, all of those are great places to remember that some of these are universal human experiences and that you're not as alone as you thought, even though all of us is slightly unique.
Right.
So I can really relate to that. So when you wrote the book, you basically were going from pathology to like a path to reclamation across those 3 sections. And I guess I'm wondering, did you always kind of expect that structure, or did it emerge kind of as you were writing?
I had no expectation that I would publish anything, especially a book. And actually someone, when I started, who was close to me said, "Oh, I can't wait till, you publish the book." And I said, "Well, that will be a cold day in hell." But after a couple of years, I just realized that I had written several hundred poems. And then when I looked for themes in the content, I could just see that there kind of was this trajectory or healing arc that that was happening or had happened, and that was occurring in my kind of life, or the sort of vision of what I saw in my life, and then also in the writing. And there is this lens that we're trained to see problems through in medicine, which is, and it matches the sections of the book, being disease, and the Latin pathos, diagnosis, diagnoses, and treatment, and sanadum, which I titled the sections that way.
One of the things I like to remember, or try to remember, is that like there's nobody here that is creating meaning about our lives except for ourselves, and so we get to create whatever we want.
Right.
Whatever
Absolutely.
makes sense to make you feel like you have overcome whatever it is. And so, we get to make it up.
Absolutely. We are the narrators. This idea of dissociative effect, is in realize, and kind of feeling sometimes like there is distance, from my life, or from a situation, that it kind of gifted me with this understanding that myself, and me being a human too, that we as humans are made up of these stories. And once you understand that, then the gift of that is that you realize that you have a hand in not just creating future stories, but also restoring some of that and making meaning of that.
Like that. So tell us a little more about why you chose the title Dissociative Effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when I was in medical school, we learned about the various, anesthetic drugs, or, drugs that are used to anesthetize people. And ketamine was always singled out because it had this dissociative effect. So that phrase, dissociative effect, has kind of been in my mind again for 20 years. I think as I was writing this book, I was also in parallel kind of engaged in this personal healing journey to change some things in my life. And so I was doing more kind of yoga and meditation practices. And it was during COVID. We put a sauna with a cold water tank in the backyard. And so kind of these more of these like mind body practices, and these things kind of helped me to reflect on the ways that, that we are kind of more or less, embodied in our lives and in our stories. And again, I just kind of was thinking a lot about kind of the stories that our bodies tell. And so this idea of dissociation or disembodiment, I think oftentimes we think of it that, I think it can be a distraction or a lack of mindful attention as we're going about our life. On the mild side, more severe would be dissociation. When we think about it as a protective mechanism, maybe someone experiences in trauma, or if taking a drug like ketamine, where the mind and the body actually separate. Those, again, might not necessarily be thought of as like through a positive lens. Ketamine was becoming more widely available and popular as a mental health treatment. You're probably aware there are kind of a lot of different ways that ketamine is used, for PTSD or depression, pain, all these things. I would say that it's not completely well understood kind of how and why that does help people. I received a ketamine treatment, because I was trying to understand, kind of how this might be helpful for my palliative care patients. And I experienced this dissociative effect of the ketamine, therapeutic ketamine. And that also led me to consider this kind of dissociation, and how that can be a proxy for this perspective shifting that I think is a necessary part of healing. And I think that refers back to what we were talking about before, perspective shifting, narrator shifting that occurs with writing, storytelling. So all of that just kind of came together, and I said that, the collection will be called Dissociative. It's the Dissociative Effect.
That's great. Well, we're up to the reading portion, and I'm wondering if before we turn to that, if you would give us a sentence or two about the she shed that you're recording from right now. So we're curious about it.
So you mentioned earlier in the interview that I'm also a parent. I'm a mother of some school-age children. And there was this thing that happened in COVID in which, those school-age children were home more. And I just said to myself at some point, this shed that I'm in was for some years, it was the kids' kind of play shed. I said, mom needs space. I need space. I needed, what is it Virginia Woolf said, a room of one's own. But I needed a place where I could kind of carve out space for myself. So I have a shed.
Good for you. I love it. All right. So now Jackie is going to share a few poems. Yeah. And feel free to, as you're sort of sharing with the listeners, feel free to, kind of share where in the book it's from and why you're sharing it.
The first poem that I'm going to read is Entering the Belly of the Whale. And this poem was written, I was thinking about the belly of the whale, and just that image of going into the whale has been kind of used in, as an archetype in many different kind of stories and, kind of different places in the world and throughout time, as, kind of people were going on journeys and transitions. And this particular poem I wrote after reading an article about a whale that was found beached. It had died on an island in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland in November of 2019. And the whale was found with 200 pounds of trash in its stomach when they did an autopsy on it. And so I was just thinking about kind of what was inside of the whale and, what is inside of us, and this feeling of kind of, there was some shame. So the stench was overwhelming as you entered into bones, blubber, organs, gristle. Such a mess was left behind when all peristalsis stopped. You tried to rid yourself of those indigestible plastic products, those islands of debris covered in thick residues of shame. While in the distance you heard laughter and the explosion of cheap Chinese fireworks littering the canvas of a perfect night sky. So that's Entering the Belly of the Whale, and that takes us into the book. This one I call Crisis in the Middle of Life. In the morning, you startle awake, remembering that you forgot to schedule an orthodontic appointment for your child. Pattern recognition in college taught you it was the tannins in the wine making you sick. Putting blame on consumption during an evening of excess would have been too simple. You are not simple. Now, if only the same purported wisdom could reveal the deeper purpose of your life and how to eschew this midlife unease. Experts say that life satisfaction follows a U-shaped curve. Happiness thrives in the young and the old, with discontent in between. You want to accept the fact that the simple and the mundane tasks now weave the tapestry of your life. Nowadays, your mind buzzes with responsibility, imbibement refers to coffee, and sleep deprivation causes you to dissociate. One glass of wine, maybe two on holidays, no indulgences, no indiscretions, fewer bad decisions, and no headaches. Your Facebook account reconnects you with an old friend who you suspect is buying OxyContin illegally on the internet. Contemplating your social media connections reminds you that the electric bill needs to be paid this month. You reflect on the fact that you will likely go to your grave not knowing the rush of heroin, then feel guilty for having had such a troubling thought. You try to be a good citizen and pay your late fines in advance when you return your overdue books this week at the library. Sometimes you consider all the kinky things you wish you had been bold enough to try in your 20s before settling down and getting married. You think part of your problem is that young people overestimate how happy they will be when they grow up. College should require a course on expectations and prepare you to lose all of your money, feel like a failure, have your heart broken, cry in front of your boss, back the car into a stationary object, and maybe, just maybe, one day you will find you are able to examine your life choices without a midlife crisis. Zoologists have shown that the great apes also get sad in middle age. You ponder this fact over one solitary glass of wine. Then I'm going to read you one from, this was kind of in the transition of the book where I started to kind of say, maybe things could be a little different. I call it seeds. Crossing terrain of the familiar within myself. Worn out voices whispered, you will always be unworthy. Of this, you will never be free. To go further, to survive, I dragged my bound soul across years with rivers of yearning to find the cave holding the shadows of my existence, those discarded remains not fit for the light of living. Broken shells, decaying bones of emptiness and being emptied, legacies of silence, my solitude, I opened you up to me. And there, in the radiance of darkness, were the seeds for a deserving life. And that takes me to the last one I'm going to read for you. This is the last poem from the book. So in the my treatment section, the practice of wanting a life. I always thought those two words, I want, were a prelude to something childishly selfish, as in, I want more ice cream. I want to stay up late tonight. And then I felt every square inch of my adult body vibrate with the loneliness that once silenced that lovely childlike sense of wanting. And then the permission to say those two words, I want, became a transition point, a passageway to reclaim my very own life. So,
man, that's really fantastic. Thank you so much, Jackie. Those were such great representations of a whole book of poems. In particular, the note about college should require a course on expectations, like the things that you listed, all of those things have happened to me. Crying in front of your boss, backing into a stationary object, having your heart broken. Speaking of universal human experiences, I could relate to all of those. That was really lovely.
Right. So it's like, why are we surprised? Why are we surprised when those things happen? Right.
Right. We shouldn't be. Yeah. So tell our listeners where they can find more about you and where they can find your book.
Sure. So they can purchase the book from the publisher. That is Shanti Arts. So www.shantiarts.com. And then it can also be purchased on Amazon and, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, those places. I have more information about the book and then my writing projects at www.jacquelineredmer.com. So I think you'll list that on your website.
Yep, we will absolutely list the links on our site. And as we record this, we're almost exactly, I think, 7 months from the release date. Do you have any appearances or signings scheduled for when this thing goes live?
No, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen.
Yeah, you'll list them on your website, right? On your own website when you do have appearances scheduled. Okay. So again, we'll list that link down at the bottom in the show notes. All right. So at this time, I want to thank Jackie for coming on, introducing everybody to Dissociative Effect. Thanks to everyone out there for hanging out with us in the Midwest Writers Room. I'm Ken Humphrey.
And I'm Luella Schmidt. Words ignite imaginations and spark change. Never underestimate the power of storytelling.
Midwest Writers Room is a production of the Wisconsin Writers Association. Writing and editing by Luella Schmidt and Ken Humphrey. Sound design and editing by Ken Humphrey. Music for the Midwest Writers Room was written by Michael Ramir C. For more information, please visit wiwrite.org/podcast. Thank you.